So this week we are talking about logistics outsourcing, and a really common question that I get, how long does it take? Coming right up. So this week we're on to the topic of logistics outsourcing. Slightly different background here. I'm working out of our Bangkok office this week. Well, it's probably 2 weeks ago by the time you watch this video. But I wanted to talk briefly about the time frame for logistics outsourcing. I've been asked 2 or 3 times this week already, how long does it take? And I suppose the simple answer is, how long is a bit of string? It depends, but let me give you a couple of very simple case studies, one where it took a very long time and one a very short time, and then at the end, I'll suggest what is a reasonable time frame. So we're talking here about outsourcing warehousing and transport. In both cases, it was a national outsourcing contract. So if you think about what needs to take place through an outsourcing process, and there are loads of videos on the channel, so do look at that if you want the detail. But if you're thinking about the process, you've really got to sort of document what it is that you're outsourcing to begin with. That takes a bit of time. You've got to decide which suppliers you're going to invite to tender, unless it's an open tender. That's very rare these days. You then have to brief them, send out all the documentation. You've got to allow sufficient time for those suppliers to put their bids together. And this is where people generally get it wrong. They don't allow enough time for suppliers to actually put their solutions together. I won't go into it too much, but because there's loads of other videos on my channel about it, but you need to allow enough time that they can absorb all the data that you're sharing, that they can work out the solution, that they can work out the resources they're going to need and the costs and so on. And that's probably an area where people need too little time. You're then going to have to go through a stage where you're evaluating all of the responses that have come into your tender. You're then going to select which ones you're going to pick. You've got to inform them of the results. You've then got to negotiate the contracts, and then you've got to implement the contract. So how long does all of that take? Let's start with a long one. So this was a while back. And I should add, I'm sort of picking from a history here of having done this a few times. I think when I last looked, we've done this 267 times in different countries around the world, different industries and so on. So I picked a couple of extremes. This is a long one, and it was a government organization, and they wanted to really get ahead of the curve, if you like, be well prepared to go to market, allow the suppliers plenty of time. We started working on it 18 months out. So there you go. And there was a lot of internal work to determine, the documentation and so on, and exactly what was going to be outsourced and what services were required and so on. All of that was done about 6 months before actually putting the tender out. Then they decided to leave, I think it was 2 months for the suppliers to actually put their solutions together. No, I tell a lie, it was 3 months, because it was quite a tricky operation. It was quite unusual, so it allowed a bit more time, and then time for evaluation and so on, and implementing the contract. So that was, an 18-month or 2-year time frame to do it all. A little bit unusual. It wouldn't probably take that long, obviously. And we'll come back to the sort of normal time frames in a moment. Let's jump to the other end of the scale then, and a very short time frame. So again, a couple of years ago, I'll sort of pick older ones, but there's you're not going to guess who they are. So a couple of years ago, a company came to us and said, we have a little bit of a problem with our warehousing and distribution contract. We've had this really tricky relationship with our 3PL. And it's getting worse, and the relationship's not going to survive, and we really want to go to market. And during our initial discussions, the 3PL basically turned around to our client and said, we've had enough. We want you out of the warehouse in 6 weeks. And this does happen. It's not the first time that I've come across this. So that really left them in a very tricky position. They had a warehouse full of product. They had to find a new 3PL very quickly, implement the contract. When they first approached us, we kind of went, well, it's going to be so hard to do that in 6 weeks. But thankfully, they'd already done some preparatory work, putting the documentation together at least. So that sort of gave us a couple of weeks. We were sort of a couple of weeks into the process, if you like. But we took it on. And obviously, it was a hugely compressed time frame. It was a real struggle. One of the first things we did was to sit down with them and say, okay, who are the other 3PLs that you'd like to have participate in this tender process, RFP, RFT, whatever you want to call it. They had a few. We threw in a couple of extras that we thought might work well with them. We briefed those companies very quickly. This is coming out. We need you to respond very quickly. We still, I think, allowed them 2 weeks to respond. It wasn't overly complex. It was a pretty basic warehousing task on their national distribution to their customers. Obviously, the shortlisting process, the evaluation was already compressed, and we managed to do it just so that all the product could be picked up, taken over to a new warehouse, and so on. So there's a couple of extremes. 18 months, 6 weeks. How long should it take? I would suggest it's going to depend on your operation, the size of the business, the complexity. But if you want a simple rule of thumb, I would say from the process of deciding that you're going to go to the market for whatever reason, you're going to outsource, you're going to change providers or whatever. So going to the market to having picked a new 3PL, let's not try and include implementation in that because that could be complicated if it's a new facility or an existing facility or whatever. So from deciding to go to the market to having gone through all your evaluation and picked a supplier, how long should you leave? An absolute minimum, I would suggest, is 3 months. I'd be more comfortable with 5 to 6. And I'd be very interested to hear your comments down below. It's not something you want to rush. If you've got a little bit more time, it's much better. As soon as you're sort of thinking of doing it, start putting the ball in motion. Really don't leave yourself with a very short time frame. It can be done shorter, like I mentioned, I did one in 6 weeks. I would not want to do that again. That was super high pressure. We were just not lucky, but we were fortunate that the client's business wasn't that complicated and it was pretty easy to outsource, so we could do it in 6 weeks. But if you're wondering about a typical time frame, 3 months probably, think of that as a minimum, and 5 or 6 if you can, just to get to the point of selection. You then got to negotiate the contract, you've got to work out the implementation, the move, and so on. So hopefully that helps. I do welcome comments down below. What's the shortest one you've seen? What's the longest one you've seen? What do you think is a fair time frame? If you need any help with your outsourcing, of course, I'll stick a link down below because I've done it loads of times. And if you want to have a chat and bounce some ideas around, I'm happy to help. So thanks for watching and see you next time. Bye for now.